Hey everybody, how's it going? Before we get into today's video, I want to ask to see if you're subscribed real quick. If you're not, it's free and it will let you know whenever we post new videos. Without further ado, despite the good times aboard the Space Exploration Force light cruiser Orion's Bow, they were still harrowing and life-threatening far too often for Zavor's liking, and against far too many exotic new threats. From cults to giant monsters to a self-styled Emperor of Space, the red-scaled Egghead had seen more horrors than any one person should, and had craved to return home to the Egghead conglomerate. The humans had a phrase about this, calling it a wish upon a monkey's paw. It was apparently an outdated term, the meaning consistent but the origin unknown. The meaning was that a wish would be granted, but in a way that made one regret ever making the wish. His wish to return home was granted via convalescence leave. Multiple broken bones and a significant amount of blood loss had marked Zavor as unfit for duty, and his friends in the crew of Orion's Bow had deemed it safer for him to be sent home until he could improve. Where this monkey's paw factored in was that he wasn't simply allowed to convalesce as a war hero, admired for his bravery and his size and his deep red scales. No. On top of the fact that he was to return to the Bow upon being cleared for service, Zavor was required to lecture at the military academy the moment he was able to leave the hospital. Over the generations, multiple academies across the various continents on the Egghead home planet of Tarvin were consolidated as the three-eyed reptiles made their way into space. Now, the multiple sections across continents were all arms of the Tarvin Military Academy, the magnet school that recruited the best of the best from across the conglomerate space. Zavor had not been invited to attend Tarvin Academy, leading to even more resentment that he was now ordered to lecture at a place that had previously deemed itself too good for him. His injuries were no longer life-threatening, downgraded to extremely inconvenient. The broken bones had been set and the fragments either extracted or glued into place, so he no longer had to worry about ruptured organs from moving around too much. Of course, this led the military man to grow stir-crazy. This, as a result, saw him signed up to lecture at Tarvin Military Academy. Egghead lecture halls were similar in shape to human ones. Barring planets with unusual particle contents in the air, the law of acoustics were essentially universal. The professor was an attractive Egghead woman named Yaraten, only a little older than Zavor himself, quite young for Egghead academia, since he had joined the military as soon as he was able. Her beige scales were bright and healthy, her conical skull coming to a nice feminine point at the back, and her short body was broad to advertise her fertility, showing off to any potential mate that she could produce a large clutch of eggs. Zavor rolled into the room, seated in a tracked mobility chair since his wounds were still too grievous for extended walking. The students immediately made sounds of quiet awe at the sight of him, and the petty officer inwardly preened. He knew he was an impressive specimen. His scales were a deep red, an incredibly rare color amongst his species. His skull came to a broad, shallow point like a gumdrop. He was slimmer than most Eggheads, but his sheer height helped make up for that deficiency. He was nearly as tall as the average male human.
"So, Zavor,"
Yaraten began, a pleasant gurgle to her voice.
"You've been assigned to a role in the human space exploration fleet. Could you tell us a little bit about what that's like?"
Zavor tipped his head back and to the right in his people's equivalent of a self-effacing smirk. Egghead mouths did not lend themselves to subtle gestures, and they could only bare their teeth when it was time to bite.
"In a word, terrifying."
His voice was a deep growl.
Or maybe horrifying's the better term. Kellen went on a tangent about the difference once. Apparently, terror is the anticipation of something frightening, while horror is when you actually experience it.
He paused, realizing he'd gotten ahead of himself.
To start from the beginning, I've been assigned to a human light cruiser called Orion's Bow. Apparently, it's named after the weapon of a hunter from human myth. It's what the humans call a HAB ship. That is, a starship that's capable of self-sustainment. The Bow has an elaborate system of hydroponics that allows it to provide food, water, and oxygen for its contingent of crew. We supplement the bland food with normal rations, but if we ran out of supplies, we could theoretically sustain indefinitely. Orion's Bow is under the command of Captain Trent Riley. He's a male human.
Zavor took a moment to look out at the class. So many trios of young, bright eyes staring back at him.
You've all seen pictures of humans, right?
At the gentle murmurs of affirmative, he continued.
Riley.
Zavor paused again.
Human naming conventions are strange. They typically have two, which they share with relative freedom. The first name is a personal name. The second identifies what family to which the human belongs. On human ships, we typically address humans by their family name.
He took a moment to figure out where he'd left off, when he barely even started.
The captain takes what he calls a hands-on approach to leadership. He can often be found conversing in person with those he wants to communicate with, despite the fact that humans have the same means of distance communication as the rest of us. Honestly, they take their communications to another level. Each human has a personal comm unit at his or her hip, and I've seen this in humans outside of the bow as well. But Riley prefers to meet in person when possible, so a lot of times you'll see him wandering the ship.
Zavor chuckled, mostly to himself.
The first time I saw him moving, I thought I had done something wrong, or we were in danger. The captain has a way of stalking through the corridors like he's on his way to attack something, but that's just how he moves.
It sounds intimidating,
Yaratan observed.
It can be,
Zavor admitted.
All humans are imposing in their own way. How they casually ignore extremes of temperature or their intensity in combat, but they're also often disarmingly friendly. Humans are earnest in a way that is difficult to express. I've seen the captain employ great duplicity in negotiations. It's not as if they can't lie or don't understand it, but I think the danger of their daily lives must lead them to value honesty and straightforwardness in a way that we might not.
The injured Ekheg took a breath.
Riley's executive officer is a man named McBride, and the commander is a harder man than Riley. Not a bad person, but...
He paused, trying to think of a good way to phrase it.
Perhaps sharper is a fair term. Riley has a natural aggression to him, but one that is not directed at his crew. McBride is stern, always watching for signs of weakness or disloyalty in his crew.
There were a few murmurs along the student body. These humans were sounding more and more dangerous.
It took me a while to accept Lieutenant Kellen.
Zavor continued.
She is, in many ways, her commander's opposite. She's soft, gentle, a clutch mother, as you might say. It felt a poor fit to have her aboard a military vessel. However, on my first mission with the bow, she was instrumental in a smooth victory. Kellen is unconventional, and her kindness helps to counterbalance McBride.
One of the students near the back piped up.
Is it true that humans live in fire?
Zavor's left and right eyes dilated in brief confusion.
Not as far as I know. But it is true that humans have an incredible durability in different biomes and conditions. They can endure cold that would cause irreparable damage to us, but can also live comfortably in temperatures that we would consider warm.
That was a shock to the students. Academically, most knew that humans were resilient and lived on a multitude of planets nowadays. To have it spelled out for them like that was still impressive.
That's part of the reason why those who work on human ships have to be carefully vetted,
Zavor continued,
and why no non-human has yet set foot on Earth. A comfortable temperature for humans aboard the Orion's bow is dangerously close to being too cold for my good health. And our Dithrian engineer finds it uncomfortably warm.
Yaratan glanced over with her leftmost eye.
The humans have a Dithrian on their crew.
Humans' animosity with the cold-weather avians was well known. The Dithrian Federation had a war machine that had rolled over all individual stellar nations until it had run into a barely shock-capable human commonwealth. The two militaries fought to a standstill, and it was a subject of debate whether the humans would have managed to win that exchange had the war continued. Zavor chuckled.
I was surprised, too, when I first heard about it. Bagheera isn't a Federation native, though. Her parents were refugees and raised her in a Nikti space.
That was basically all the explanation that was needed. The four-eyed insectoids were strange to the rest of the galaxy, and someone who was raised among them wouldn't behave the same as warmongering Dithrians. Professor Yaratan addressed Zavor again.
So, for those who might aspire to work on a human ship, what is the average day like?
Zavor spread his arms.
Honestly, it's not terribly different from most other vessels. It's more unique living on a HAB ship than the fact that the crew are humans. One of the biggest things to note with humans is that they're quick to form cliques. These aren't necessarily exclusionary, but humans love to form or adopt small tribes. Usually these cliques form out of proximity, such as engineers assembling into one, but that's not a guarantee. Each little group will have its own inside jokes and behavioral conventions, and so you need to learn how to navigate these, keeping to standard human attitudes until you seem to be welcomed, to use the clique's terms, and familiarity is generally the best decision.
The injured lecturer took a moment to remember where he'd left off before the question sent him on a different tangent.
So, you asked what life was like, and I said, horrifying. To elaborate, I don't think my experience was normal. At least, I hope it was not. My first mission, which had been intended as a simple shakedown operation, turned into a battle to stop a cult and rescue captives. There were very few operations which went smoothly, without some surprise or twist. We fight for our lives, and many people lose theirs. The humans are hardy, but they can't fix everything.
A girl in the middle of the crowd, with scales so pale they were nearly gray, piped up.
What was the scariest situation you found yourself in?
Zavor took a moment to consider.
There are a lot of candidates, and I know how awful that sounds. I've probably been in worse scrapes since, but the sheer panic of being chased by a giant monster stands out to me the most. We crash-landed on a Deathworld in the southeastern fringe,
he elaborated, and already saw students wince. The galactic southeast was no man's land, populated almost entirely by pirates, warlords, and madmen. It was unknown if there was sapient species in that nebula-choked mass of stars. But the discovery of humans at the edge of the fringe, and the subsequent revelation that the mammals lived on a world with a molten core and were intimately familiar with the horrors of death worlds that had inflicted generational trauma upon the galaxy, had caused many stellar cartographers to reissue their galactic maps with the classic "Here be monsters" line over the vague mass of the galactic southeast.
To shorten a long story, I found myself being hunted by a gigantic insectoid monster, easily the size of a small freighter.
Zavor's mention of a beast the size of a 2-story home was even more unsettling.
It tore open my back, and if it hadn't been for Carver's first aid spray, I'd likely be dead. As it was, I had to lie there while the humans killed the thing.
The Marine had helped Zavor to hide out of the massive beetle's reach.
Was that what left you so injured?
The girl asked, clearly meaning his current state. Zavor gave a quick jerk of his head in the negative.
No, that was, months ago now, I think. If not a little longer. Time tends to blur on deployment, especially aboard a ship that doesn't actually need to restock its supplies.
One student near the front, a young man with brown scales, politely raised his hand.
On the subject of injuries, I've heard rumors about humans living through impossible things. Have you seen anything like that?
Zavor tilted back his head in another smirk.
You'll have to be more specific,
he quipped, continuing before the boy could refine his question.
I've seen humans do insane things and heard tell of far more. One that I witnessed, which stands out to me, had to do with Captain Riley himself. When we fought that giant monster, it hit him in the leg, and Riley was limping until we got back to the ship, where the medic explained that his knee had been dislocated. The joint had been completely forced out of the socket,
he explained to horrified gasps and murmurs. Eggheads were sturdy, but not flexible at all. The idea of a joint being ripped from its socket meant to an egghead a crippling injury and only the slightest of chances to ever heal from it.
The medical officer wrenched the captain's knee back into place, and after a night's rest where he didn't strain it, Riley was walking around good as new.
Zavor finished his story. The student was stunned.
How is that possible?
The red egghead tapped his chin to his left shoulder in a shrug.
Humans are flexible. More so than Nasav or Dithrians. Their tendons and ligaments can stretch to degrees that would be devastating to other species, and they seem built to pop their joints back into place. Ugh.
He clenched his teeth in a grimace, remembering how Lieutenant Danica Kellen's smooth flexibility had allowed her to stand from a stealthy crawl when his more limited range of motion had forced him to walk his hands up a wall to stand up without fanfare.
And when I asked about it, nearly everyone on the crew had a story of a dislocated joint, usually at the shoulder, but sometimes the hip. The knee's apparently rare to dislocate, but it's still fixable.
Another student spoke up.
Was that the worst injury you saw?
Zavor gave his head a brief side-to-side jerk.
Nope. The worst injuries were probably the deaths in the crash that led to that fight, but if you're asking survivable injuries, still no.
He took another breath.
One of the worst I saw personally was with Turnbull, one of the Marines.
The biggest man on the cruiser by a fair margin. Turnbull was also an adrenaline junkie who sought out combat as his drug of choice.
I still don't know exactly what they were doing, but a few of the Marines and crew were playing some sort of game in one of the bays. Apparently, someone bumped something he shouldn't have, and one of the shuttles started rotating. The wing caught Turnbull in the leg and sent him into a bizarre angle, and the bone in his upper leg broke in half. It was so bad that the splintered bone tore through his skin and jutted up through his thigh. A collective shudder went through the class as they envisioned the injury.
Did he have to go on convalescence leave?
The student asked. Since Zavor had said this was not a lethal injury, nobody had to ask if the Marine had died, but that still sounded awful.
Amazingly, no.
The red egghead replied.
Humans keep first aid spray on hand pretty much everywhere. It's some sort of aerosolized sealant that keeps blood in and particulates out. Certainly saved my life when that monster tore my back open. If Carver hadn't used some to stop my bleeding, it's unlikely I'd be alive today,
he added as an aside.
They sprayed over Turnbull's wound and they called for a stretcher and they took him to the medical bay. There, the medic dissolved the spray and grabbed the bone, wrenching it back into place.
He motioned with his hands to emphasize how this might have happened, clutching at some imaginary protrusion and forcing it down. Another collective wince moved through a little more than half of the crowd. The remainder more in disbelief and unable to accept that such a thing was real.
And then he used organic glue to bond the bone together, sealed the wound, and put Turnbull in a cast before calling him an idiot. He was unable to work for about a month, and we all made fun of him.
A collective laugh rose up from the crowd. The question about fire earlier did remind me, Zavor mused, about Carver.
Most human military personnel have at least a few scars, but Carver seems to be more scar tissue than undisturbed skin. He's not much older than the rest of the Marines, so I don't know if he's incredibly fortunate to have survived all of those things, or incredibly unlucky to have gotten into all that trouble in the first place. He took a breath. I haven't asked about all of his injuries. Just feels rude, as though I'd be treating him like an exhibit. But his voice is raspy from fire damage. The worst thing is, to hear him tell it, he got the injury on shore leave.
That statement seemed to have the class on the edge of their seats, so Zavor continued. Jacob Carver was looking forward to some much-needed time off. The war against the Dithrian Federation was over, and he had lost too many friends to the Avians. While he had re-enlisted, he was thankful that he wouldn't have to fight any more of the damn Spenguins. In the aftermath of the war, humanity had earned respect and the chance for friendship among the stars. Already, the higher-ups in the Space Exploration Force were preparing to travel into galactic neutral territory to discuss colonization rights, wanting to go through all the proper channels in order to reinforce that humans were good neighbors when given no cause to be bad ones. The politicking had no real interest to Jacob. He simply wanted to relax. With a nice stipend from the SEF, he'd secured a hotel aboard the Tensei habitat orbiting Saturn. He could spend some much-needed time just decompressing, partying, and indulging in the basest human passions. He got to his hotel, unpacked his luggage, and got changed into a nice outfit. The dark gray jacket went well with his close-shorn brown hair and chocolate eyes, and it didn't make his skin look too pale by comparison. His scars still made themselves known, but he just had to live with that. They make good conversation starters in some cases, and the adage held true far more often than not. Chicks dig scars. He headed downstairs and ordered some drinks at the hotel bar, getting a nice buzz before properly setting out for a night in the town. Outside, in the void of space, a minor chunk of the Dithrian warship spiraled through the blackness. For the most part, salvage efforts had cleaned up the debris, for recycling and study as much as for safety, but in the aftermath of a war, pieces could go missing in the sheer vastness of outer space. In any other situation, this would have no impact. Every station in arcology had a network of rail cannons to destroy approaching stellar detritus. This particular detritus, however, was a chunk of starship, including its exterior plating. The automated weapons performed their duty, identifying that the approaching object was not a spacefaring vessel and then opening fire. But rather than breaking the offending debris into so much space dust the shots sheared it apart, most of the metal was eventually destroyed. But a shard of the structure's support beam hurtled toward the space station like a spear. Alarms blared across Tensei as the fragment, caught in Saturn's gravity, accelerated towards the habitat. Despite the fact that the habitat ceilings displayed an artificial sky, everyone reflexively looked up. The ceiling burst open, the piece of superstructure driving through the station's plating like a tack. And then, violent decompression ripped it back out. Air surged out of the habitat section with such force that people and objects were pulled from the ground and funneled toward the breach. In the moments between the impact and the deployment of the bulkheads to cut off the rupture, people and vehicles had been pulled hundreds of feet into the air. Smaller structures were ripped from their foundations, accelerant dripping from torn pipes to meet with active electrical wires and spawn fast-spreading fires. It was as much luck as skill and instinct that saved Carver's life. The sturdy veteran had grabbed for the nearest big object, clinging to a truck and crawling alongside it as the vehicle spiraled through the air. When the vacuum suction cut out, he leapt onto a nearby building rather than riding the truck back down to certain death. The building on which he found himself, however, was in an unhealthy state. He could smell and hear fire, and screams for help rose from within. To stay atop it was a death sentence, as response teams would have far bigger problems to deal with than plucking a single man off the roof of a burning restaurant. Carver would have to brave the flames and get out before they became impenetrable. He threw himself against the rooftop access door several times before it finally gave way.
Oh, shit!
His expletive turned into an aborted yelp as he had to ride the door like a sled down a flight of stairs. There was no way this place was up to code. The door hit the wall at the bottom of the stairs, which meant that he subsequently hit the wall, only barely managing to turn and impact with his back rather than his head and neck. He staggered out into a forked hallway, wandering into the kitchen. From there, he presumed the double doors led to the dining area. Several of the ovens had been damaged by falling debris ripping through the wall, and fire blazed along the side of the kitchen. The screams had mostly died down, likely people filtering out, but he could still hear a single high-pitched shriek coming from the dining area. Giving the flames a wide berth, Carver pushed open the doors to find a conflagration engulfing much of the area. He couldn't presume to know how it traveled from the kitchen, or if these had been concurrent fires, and honestly, he didn't much care. He could hear a child's voice, a young girl.
Please! Please!
She wailed.
Anybody! My dad's trapped!
Carver staggered forward, coughing into the smoke. He shucked his jacket and he wrapped it around his face. Wasn't as good as a soaked shirt, but anything would do to filter out the particulates.
Where are you? I'm coming!
Over here!
The girl shrieked.
By the bar!
Carver found a blonde-haired young girl, probably less than 10 years old, with the even, light tan of living under ultraviolet arcology lighting. She was crouching down to avoid the cloying smoke overhead, struggling against a fallen ceiling. Some of the upper structure had collapsed, burying several people beneath it, but the girl was focused on a pair of legs that were still twitching.
Stand back! I need to get around this, and I don't want to step on you.
He warned the girl. Carver studied how the ceiling structure had come down, the angle at which it lay.
All right, I need you to be strong, girl, he said to her. When I lift this, grab your dad's leg and pull with all your might. You gotta drag him out of here. And don't you dare give up, even if it feels like your bones are breaking, until I say so. Okay?
The girl nodded, bright green eyes shining with tears. The scarred military man squatted down and worked his fingers under the frame, his groan of effort rising into a roar of exertion as he lifted the enormous weight. The girl mirrored him, letting out a ragged, eardrum-rattling scream as she clutched her father's ankle and pulled. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the man moved. He'd been pinned awkwardly, and when his first arm came free, her father proved he was still alive and conscious by grabbing for purchase and helping his daughter to pull him free. Finally, Carver let the mask drop, collapsing onto his behind and panting for air.
You okay, man?
He asked the father. The other man, who had brown hair and blue eyes, wheezed. His eyes widened in distress, and panic worsened the situation. Having seen similar situations before, Carver quickly diagnosed it.
Lay on your back again. Your windpipe's been crushed. You keep wheezing like that and you'll close it completely. Just focus on slow, shallow breaths.
Carver would need to perform a field tracheotomy. Thankfully, the bar would likely have a metal stirring straw. He climbed over the debris and began shuffling through the detritus behind the bar for his prize. Too late, he noticed the hissing noise of a gas pipe breaking. In a panic, Carver grabbed for a handful of simple plastic straws instead and tried to leap backwards, but the gas was already igniting. A stream of fire like a dragon's breath washed over him, flooding his face. He reflexively closed his eyes and gasped in pain, letting the flame rush down his throat like a pack of ravenous hounds clawing and biting at everything. Eyebrows and most of what little hair he had seared off. Jacob Carver staggered back to the man and child, coughing and shaking. It was his turn to wheeze. His vocal cords wouldn't work, too raw and ragged from the scouring fire. He dropped to his knees and drew his field knife, gesturing with knife and straw, hoping the man would understand. The father looked frightened, tears of anxiety beading at the corners of his eyes, but he gave a thumbs up and gave his daughter a brave smile. Good man, Carver thought. Carver gestured to himself, taking a deep breath, waiting for the man to follow, then gave a motion he hoped the man would interpret as hold it. The veteran lightly jabbed the knife just above the curve of the man's sternum, piercing the flesh and causing blood to well. Then he wedged the straw into the opening, and he pinched it with 2 fingers to gently hold it in place. He theatrically exhaled, gesturing for his impromptu patient to do the same. A spattering of blood shot out the straw. Carver smiled and nodded. With the father taking weak but steady breaths, Carver looped one of the man's arms around his shoulders and carried him out. The father's other hand was occupied with holding his daughter's. Professor Yarton was the first to react when Zavor finished recounting Carver's story.
That's incredible, she murmured. We hear stories about how humans survive on a death world, but it's just so far outside of our realm of expertise. Stories like this, they help us to better understand exactly what it means that humans are a death world species.
Zavor chuckled softly.
That's not the conclusion I drew from that, Professor. Although, by the first time I'd heard it, I'd lived among the humans for several months.
The beige-scaled professor tilted her head, silently requesting for the red ekeg to continue his train of thought.
For humans, life ends. More often and in more disturbing ways than most of us could imagine. I don't ask about Earth's predators or cataclysms anymore.
Zavor shook his head.
It'd be easy to hear all the things we do about humans and conclude that they're a grim people, careless of death because it happens so often. The way that they plan for mass death, we could decide that they consider life to be cheap. But from what I've seen, that is not the case. Humans value life in themselves and others. They prepare for mass deaths because they see it as inevitable. And they'd rather as few as possible die rather than losing everyone in a desperate attempt to save everyone.
It was particularly resonant because almost everyone knew of a space station or arcology that had been recently refitted to conform to human standards. Human stations had multiple failure points designed to break off and sacrifice a portion of the structure to save the rest.
Humans,
Zavor continued.
Humans, Zavor continued, will more often than not risk their own lives to save someone else's because they'd want someone else to do the same for them. They come up with elaborate ways to get around seemingly lethal injuries and preserve the vital organs because to persist is human nature.
A student raised her hand. How does that reconcile with stories from the war? I know the Dithrians were on the other side, so there's going to be some bias. But there are stories of the humans just slaughtering their way through enemy lines, shooting to kill every time, using devastating weaponry for maximum death. How does that align with the humans you portray who value life? Zavor tilted back his head in a smirk.
I had the same question in my mind after I watched them utterly massacre that cult. It was a slaughter, no quarter given. How could I square that human idiom with the humans who'd spend so much time ensuring that Megira and I were healthy? And I think I figured it out. See, I said before that humans value life. In a sense, to humans, life is a currency to be spent. In general, they want to make sure that their lives and those of others aren't spent frivolously. But, well, if someone else wants to try ending your life, then you can ensure that he spends his own life as cheaply as possible.
From there, the lecture hall fell into a pattern of theorizing about human values and Zavor, for the most part, being stumped. Eventually, the class came to an end, and the Red Ekek was allowed to return to the hospital, away from Tarvin Military Academy. He never did manage to get Professor Yarton's number.
I hope you enjoyed that story. Click right here to watch another video with the same characters.